again. So just to pick up where we left off, we were discussing King's idea of intrinsic value based off of some things that he stated within the nature of his text. And we were looking at the implications of intrinsic value and how he might mean it, right? But let's move forward on to what I've labeled the sixth core component of the movement, of the nonviolent movement, and a core component of King's nonviolent philosophy. It says that it is as much a moral obligation to refuse to cooperate with evil as it is to cooperate with the good. Unquote. 48. In other words, against the mores of the time, and frankly ours, quote, non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as the cooperation with the good. And that's page 48. So what's the implication of this? Well, for King, agents that are a part of the SNCC, of course he's talking about the student nonviolent, student body, the student movement, but he's also talking about himself and his own philosophy. And essentially, the implications of him bringing that up is that the agents within are, quote, willing to stand up courageously on the idea of civil disobedience. And that's page 48, which is honestly a calling, a moral obligation that all citizens should have. Not that King says that yet, but these are the reasons why, he points out to this. And he does say things like that, right? So King anticipates objectors here. So he clarifies here by saying, look, I can see some people saying, like, this isn't really civil disobedience because the Supreme Court has, authorized this, and we're essentially just following the law, the federal law. So something is not civil disobedience if we understand civil disobedience as, quote, breaking the laws. These people of the student movement might argue. He says for them, quote, we are obeying the law because we are obeying, quote, the Supreme Court decision of 1954, unquote. But King does seem to acknowledge the contradictions in law at this moment in history because of the South's reluctance to follow and implement it. King says, even if we are following the Supreme Court's decision of 1954, at the time we would disobey certain laws that exist on the statutes of the South today, unquote, 48. So he recognizes sort of that contradiction, so it raises questions, at least in defending and justifying these positions, raises questions for objectors to point out logical consistency, right? So King says, how can you be logically consistent when you advocate obeying some laws and disobeying other laws? ? And this is page 48. So King has an answer to this as well. He says, that if we view the wider picture here and try to not be so hyper-focused on this law thing without any context of the outside picture or the larger aggregate, right? Then it could be easy to be bogged down in this way. However, if we look if we're honest with ourselves, we can see what's going on. He says, how can you be logically consistent when you advocate obeying some laws and disobeying other laws? 48. He says, well, I think one would have to see the whole meaning of this movement at this point by seeing that the students recognize that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws, quote, unquote. And 48, we, King's movement and the student movement, they, would be the first to obey the just laws. They would be the first to say that men and women have a moral obligation to obey just and right laws, unquote. 48. So there is King saying that it is a moral obligation for people to take a stand. And also, we/they, as I'm sort of, if I may embody King, quote, would go on to say that we must see that there are unjust laws. 48. So this is getting into sort of a subsection of my lecture here that I've titled Natural Law Theory, or Philosophical Theologian Dr. King's Natural Law Theory. So I make a distinction here between two things that King talks about. And the first is I've labeled AA and called it a just law. The second I've labeled BB, and I call this unjust law. So let's find out what a just law is for King, according to this particular article. If you actually wanted to get a more comprehensive view, you could look at all of his writings and even combine this with a letter from Birmingham jail, which I think has a better synopsis on his natural law theory. But a just law, I put equals, quote, a just law is a law that squares with the moral law, / the highest good, / the law of God. And then this is back to King. I just sort of inserted that, right? Because it's consistent with what he's saying. It is a law that squares with that which is right, so that any law that uplifts human personality is a just law. And that's for page 49. So let's go down to BB, the unjust law section. So unjust law equals, quote, that law which is out of harmony with the moral and is a law which does not square with the moral law of the universe. And then I've inserted this part, / the highest law / the law of God, page 49. So because it does not, quote, square with the law of God, it is unjust, and any law that degrades the human personality is an unjust law. 49. So here we see King is appealing to a universal law, a higher law, and King is opposing what is often called legal moralism, or sometimes called legal positivism, which is the idea that morality is enshrined in law. But, an obvious objection to this is look at chattel slavery, look at segregation in the U.S. in the in the 50s and 60s that King's fighting against, right? Clearly, just based off of history and evidence in history, this can't be the case. It's not the case. So, in a sense, King is objecting to this culture of legal moralism, which is actually very common today. Even in our society, 2016 and beyond, this idea that especially fundamentalist Christian values from the majority people in power ought to be enshrined in law, which is not really Christianity. It's like a Christian nationalism, so it's like a fake Christianity, but neither here nor there for King. So after King says this, so now to tie it, that it can tie and often does tie into natural law theory, here's another philosophical thing that King is doing called social contract theory. And there are all kinds of social contract theory with Enlightenment philosophers, like Hobbes does one, John Locke, who else? John Rawls. So, like, for example, in John Rawls, which I think King's is pretty close to John Rawls' social contract theory, in order to build a just society, John Rawls talks about people. It's like a thought experiment, right? And it's called the veil of ignorance, right? And they are covered by a veil of ignorance, and this veil of ignorance is symbolic in the sense that people are no longer bound to class, or at least if they are these people in this society that are, within certain classes or races or sexes and, genders and religions and things, all of these things that, affect people's situatedness in the society, right? The idea of making this just society is that everyone is making it sort of in a democratic fashion with a veil of ignorance on, right? And they are doing it in ways that they cannot be egocentrically constructing, because they are sort of doing it with this veil of ignorance on, right? Where they are imagining the most just society in ways that cannot benefit their situatedness, because everyone is sort of blind in this sort of situated sense. So in a similar way, King has some sort of objections that he anticipates from his natural law theory, which he answers with social contract theory. Natural law often does imply a type of design or designer. The designer can be sort of more naturalistic, but it can also be theistic, but also those sort of terms are not opposites necessarily. Naturalistic and theistic, for example, there's things like pantheism, where God is immanent in creation. But the point being is, social contract theory is absolutely unattached. I mean, there are certainly ways people could lump it in as a ad hoc to some sort of theistic worldview, but they he anticipates King anticipates atheistic or secular objections to this argument, and so he sort of embodies them here, and he says, quote, "That does not mean anything to me. First, I don't believe in these abstract things called moral laws, and I'm not too religious. Unquote. 49. And so, I'm extending this embodiment. I'm an atheist. Quote, so I don't believe in the law of God. You have to get a little more concrete and more practical. So, what do you mean when you say that a law is unjust and a law is just? 49. Well, King has a response. He says, quote, well, I would go on to say in more concrete terms that an unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on the minority that is not binding on itself. So this becomes difference between the majority and the minority made legal. There's all kinds of things that King could be referencing here in the society at this time, but one of the most striking things is de jure segregation. I think perhaps even other examples that could be utilized is the extra-legal lynchings that took place with white people on black people without really any legal punishment. The law would just often turn a blind eye to this kind of stuff, and often still does. So King says, there's another way we can talk about this too, in our social contract theory and social contract ethics, right? King says, quote, another thing that we can say is that an unjust law is a code which the majority inflicts upon the minority, which is similar to how he has stated it already, which that minority had no part in enacting or creating, because that minority had no right to vote in many instances. So that the legislative bodies that made these laws were not democratically elected. Who could ever say that the legislative body of Mississippi was democratically elected? Or the legislative body of Alabama was democratically elected? These are like some of the most racist places of this time. Birmingham was thought to be number one at one point. When there are people in Terrell County and in other counties, because of the color of their skin, who cannot vote, they, these people of color, these black people, confront reprisals and threats and all that. So that an unjust law is a law that individuals did not have a part in creating or enacting because they were denied the right to vote. Page 49. So essentially, pretty self-explanatory. King's like, look, in this sort of social contract, our people, if I may embody King, right? I'm not his people, but if I may embody, right? Psychologically, I'm there with you guys, but our people never had the chance to vote. So how could we sort of decide or participate in the society if we are eliminated from it from the beginning? Then you could even go back further, talking about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and those things which claim the right to liberty, justice, and all these things, but often actually meant just white males. So yeah, pretty straightforward, but a astute point. So here's another component that, going back to the core components of the nonviolent movement and nonviolent philosophy, where he says, another component of the nonviolent movement is that the I've labeled this I under 6, that the individual agents who stand up in the civil disobedience are not necessarily anarchists, which there's often that sort of claim that those who are not following law and order, they just don't respect the law. He says they're not anarchists. They stand up because they recognize something unjust happening. They recognize the difference between just laws, right, and unjust laws. 49 is sort of where I referenced that from, and here's an actual quote. They believe that there are laws which must be followed. The people of the student movement, or even King's movement itself. They do not seek to defy the law. They do not seek to evade the law. For many individuals who would call themselves segregationists and who would hold on to segregation at any cost actually seek to defy the law. They seek to evade the law, and their process can lead on into anarchy. They seek, in the final analysis, to follow a way of uncivil disobedience, not civil disobedience. And I submit that the individual who disobeys the law, whose conscience tells him it is unjust, and who is willing to accept the penalty by staying in jail until that law is altered, is expressing at the moment the very highest respect for law. Unquote 49. That is a quote that often gets a lot of attention for King, and I think that is phenomenal. For me, as a person who does respect law, I've always felt like that is supererogatory, which is basically a word in ethics, which is like something that goes beyond the bare minimum requirements of being just, and you sort of go beyond that duty and reach another level that is sort of higher. And in a way, I could see it being that way, sort of a supererogatory action. However, I myself would have trouble doing what is right by standing up against the law when they're unjust, and then sitting in a jail cell for the violation of that unjust law. To me, that seems like, for me, I personally feel that I could not do that. I may not have a choice, right? But I feel that if I violate the unjust law, I shouldn't have to do any jail time for that. As a matter of fact, it feels like that's a civil duty. Of course, like, how are you going to prove that? This is, where democracy and gets complicated, and with the way ours works, where you hire lawyers and all that. But nevertheless, we're talking about sort of the philosophical principles, and that is definitely a high standard, perhaps even supererogatory, as I stated. All right, so then he talks about civil disobedience, which I made a section of its own, which we could call part of the core principles, but I didn't necessarily, because he's talking about things historically with civil disobedience. And basically, King says that civil disobedience is not new. And he says, quote, "We go back and read the Apology and the Credo, and you see Socrates practicing civil disobedience. And to a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because of Socrates, because Socrates practiced civil disobedience, unquote, 50. Of course, in a lot of ways, King is like a liberation theologian, and I mean, there's King inspired black liberation theology, actually. One of my favorite philosopher theologians that is a black liberation theologian is named James Cone, and he actually wrote his first book 1960 he was writing it before King was assassinated, and then when King was assassinated, it's probably his most angry book. It's great, but by the time he published it, it was 1969, and it's called Black Power and Black Theology, or maybe no, Black Theology and Black Power. And it's an excellent book. It's actually, that book is what I have, one publication that I wrote is based off of that book called Is It a Requisite for a Believer to be a Part of the Formal Institutional Christian Church? I was writing that at a Catholic institution, so the question had to be addressed because Catholics are very institutional. Nevertheless, the point of bringing that up is that King goes into talking about civil disobedience for Christians and using this space to talk about civil disobedience in Christianity because he is talking at a nation that, as Cone mentioned earlier in the integrationist and black nationalist conversation, who professes these values, right? So King says, quote, "The early Christians practiced civil disobedience in a superb manner to a point where they were willing to be thrown to the lions. They were willing to face all kinds of suffering in order to stand up for what they knew was right, even though they knew it was against the laws of the Roman Empire," unquote. He says, also along the lines here of civil disobedience, we also have to be aware of what kinds of laws are taking place in society, and we need to raise our awareness beyond this legal moralism. So this part also connects with his social contract theory argument, but also natural law theory argument as well. And he says, quote, "We must never forget that everything that Hitler did in Germany was legal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in the days of Hitler's Germany. But I believe that if I had the same attitude then as I have now, I would publicly aid and comfort my Jewish brothers in Germany if Hitler were alive today, calling this an illegal process. If I lived in South Africa today in the midst of the white supremacy law, apartheid, in South Africa, I would join Chief Luthuli and others in saying, 'Break these unjust laws,'" unquote. 50. Then he turns the direction back to America, the United States, and says, quote, "Our nation, in a sense, came into being through a massive act of civil disobedience, for the Boston Tea Party was nothing but a massive act of civil disobedience. Those who stood up against the slave laws, the abolitionists, by and large practiced civil disobedience. So I think these students are in good company. And they feel that by practicing civil disobedience, they are in line with men and women through the ages who have stood up for something that is morally right," unquote. 50. And implicitly here, you should be too. Of course, he's trying to from this integrationist approach that we've talked about. He's trying to win over these white liberals and moderates that have concerns or may not necessarily be on board with all the methods. Like, I agree with your end, I just don't agree with your methods, right? 7. So this is another thing that I've labeled as another core component of King's nonviolent philosophy and the movement, the student movement. Quote, "It is a revolt against the negative peace that has encompassed the South for many years," unquote. So negative peace is a really important term for King, and we have brushed over this briefly earlier when we first started Love Law and Civil Disobedience. But negative peace for King is the same thing that Malcolm X calls being an Uncle Tom, or being degraded, or whitewashed, or anything like that. Any of the terms that he would utilize. And there are times when King does use those words too, especially as we get to the later King, because even though King was an integrationist and kind of started out in a different place than Malcolm as far as their political activism, they actually end up being like this by the end of, before they're assassinated. They're actually kind of converge and meet in the middle, maybe even go past each other a little bit. From the black nationalist side to the integrationist side, from the integrationist side to the black nationalist side. Now, he says that there are maybe some objectors from white people of black people breaking from their negative peace, and he embodies this sort of critique that he gets. In Montgomery, for all these years, we have been such a peaceful community. We have had so much harmony in race relations. And then you people have started this movement and boycott, and it has done so much to disturb race relations. And we just don't love the Negro like we used to love them, because you have destroyed the harmony and the peace that we once had in race relations." Unquote. 50. God help me. King responds. I've actually heard this same thing in modern day. I've literally heard this in 2020. King responds. He preps himself in nonviolent terms before he responds to this guy that he's embodied in his speech. He says, we have never had peace in Montgomery, Alabama. We have never had peace in the South. We have had a negative peace, which is merely the absence of tension. We have had a negative peace in which the Negro patiently accepted his situation and his plight. But we've never had true peace. We've never had a positive peace. And what we're seeking now is to develop this positive peace. For we must come to see that peace is not merely the absence of some negative force. It is the presence of a positive force. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, but it is the presence of justice and brotherhood. I put /sisterhood. I think this is what Jesus meant when he said, I come not to bring peace, but a sword, unquote. Now, Jesus didn't mean he came to start a war, to bring a physical sword. And he didn't mean I come not to bring a positive peace. But I think what Jesus was saying in substance was this, that I come not to bring an old negative peace, which makes for stagnant passivity and deadening complacency. I come to bring something different. And whenever I come, a conflict is precipitated between the old and the new. Whenever I come, a struggle takes place between justice and injustice, between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. I come not to bring a negative peace, but a positive peace, which is brotherhood, sisterhood, which is justice, which is the kingdom of God. 51, unquote 51. That's, there's a bunch of quotes that King has that I've read, 500 to 1,000 times or more. And that's one that often still hits me with force because it's also antagonistic against this idea of the kingdom of God being some sort of heavenly other world, and that actually the kingdom of God within Christianity is being enacted right here, right now on earth. And interestingly, I don't know if this relates or how it does. There's even a verse that Jesus says in the New Testament that says the kingdom of God is within, which some of you may remember from our Indian philosophy section. Nevertheless, another core component, and it's perhaps things like this to why King was so influenced by Gandhi. But another core component, I've labeled 8 here, of the nonviolent movement is a revolt against tokenism. King describes tokenism as the attempt by white America and its institutions to, quote, feel that in the struggle, the Negro will be satisfied with tokens of integration, unquote, ... unquote, 51. This is a process where, as King says, just a few students in a few schools here and there, and just a few doors open here and there, 51, and obviously this is for black people within the white society, right? This is something that still happens today, and I don't think he's talking about in a practical sense, because if you in a number sense, right? Not every area, if you take the whole population of black people in the U.S. and compare it to the whole population of white people in the U.S. At this time that he was writing this, it was very stark difference. King actually gives the percentage in one of the books, one of his writings, but I think it was 70-something% white and 20 or 30% black. So logistically, that can't happen. But integration for King, because there's too many white spaces, and if you're going to sort of try to put them all out evenly and integrate all these spaces, you're going to have tokenism regardless. So he's not really talking about that. He's talking about the sort of attitude and state of just essentially the racist state and the racist institutions of just we're just going to meet a quota just to say we have our token black person who's in the psychology department, or our token black person who is in the philosophy department, or works at the local farmer market, whatever it may be. So this is something that white Americans and their policies, legalities, and institutions pull to pacify the movement. King says, but this isn't the meaning of the movement, and I think that honesty impels me to admit it everywhere I have the opportunity, that the Negro's aim is to bring about complete integration in American life. And he has come to see that token integration is a little more than token democracy, which ends up with many new evasive schemes, and it ends up with new types, new discrimination, covered up with such niceties of complexity. King says, there's evidence for this. He says, quote, the movement has thrived in many communities that had token integration. Meaning like the movement is thriving in these communities that are combating this token integration. So this reveals that the movement is based on a principle that integration must be real and complete, not just a token integration. 51. So another core component of nonviolent philosophy and the movement is that it is a revolt against what Dr. King calls, quote, the myth of time, unquote. And dear God, if I had money from every time I heard this, even in modern day from people in the South, I'd be the richest man alive. It was such a cliche, and it's so sad, and more, probably for me, it's more infuriating that I'm still hearing this when King wrote this in the 60s, and it's 2025, almost 2026. King embodies the complicit here, this myth of time person. He says that if we only be patient and only pray, which we must do, we must be patient and we must pray. Yes, we should. But there are those who say, just do these things and wait for time. Time will solve the problem. Unquote, 51. And perhaps King is being charitable towards the complicit and complacent here. Well, the people who argue this do not themselves realize that time is neutral, that it can be used constructively or destructively. At point of ill will, the segregationists have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. So individuals in the struggle must come to realize that it is necessary to aid time, that without this kind of aid, time itself will become an ally of the insurgent and primitive forces of social stagnation. Therefore, the movement is a revolt against the myth of time. Unquote, 51. So, essentially, if we just say it'll happen in time, it won't happen. It will actually work against us. So it takes the conscious deliberation of each and individual agent working against the forces of ill will. Sort of like that quote that the forces of evil don't take a break. 10. Another core component of the nonviolent philosophy and the nonviolent movement is that, quote, it is a movement based on faith in the future. It is a movement based on hope, unquote, 52. There's something existential about the hope, and that in the face of absurdity. So this is my 2 cents on this. After every time I read King at the end of this, where he's talking about how he's reflecting on the freedom rides, and how they know they're about to be abused, but are singing "We Shall Overcome." To me, I gather something existential. I mean, there's something like, theological. There's something, faithful about it as well. But there's something existential about continuing against absurdity, continuing against the absurd. And it's continuing against death. It's continuing against self-sacrificial, temporal, physical abuse for ideally, not even guaranteed, a profound outcome, but certainly a profound purpose, and even jail time. Yet King says, we and the student movement are still able to sing, quote, "We shall overcome," unquote, King says. And then he says, here's the quote, that gets me at what I was talking about, but also it gives an insight to King's metaphysical view about the universe, and about truth, and about justice. And he says, so I'm reading it from the actual text here, and it says, "Then something caused me to see at that moment, on the bus, the real meaning of the movement, that students had faith in the future, that the movement was based on hope, that this movement had something within it that says somehow, even though the arc of the moral universe is long, it bends toward justice." 52. So let me unpack sort of the metaphysics there. There's a metaphysical view here that truth conquers, and I think this is very Christian, like actual Christianity, not Christian nationalism. That truth conquers, and it conquers in a way from the most humbling and unlikely sources, right? How someone can be assassinated by the state, not because God told him to, or not because he must pay God back for our sins, or something like that. Substitutionary theory of atonement, right? But because a man is innocent and is murdered by the state, but the truth of that experience
or event
and of that injustice finds a way to transcend that moment in time to over 2,000 years later. So I think that is, it's pretty profound. And here's a final great quote from King that I think is also in tune with this same premise. He says, "Before the victory is won, some will lose jobs. Some will be called communists and Reds, and merely because they will believe in brotherhood/sisterhood. Some will be dismissed as dangerous rabble-rousers and agitators, merely because they're standing up for what is right. But we shall overcome." That is the basis of this movement. And as I like to say, there is something in the universe that justifies Carlyle in saying, "No lie can live forever. We shall overcome," because there is something in the universe which justifies William Cullen Bryant in saying, "Truth crushed to the earth shall rise again." We shall overcome because there is something in the universe that justifies James Russell Lowell in saying, "Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above God's own." Unquote. 52, 53. And if I recall correctly, the scaffold here is sort of a term that can be like an assassination place, someone where people are lynched or killed according to the commands on the throne or something like that. Let me see. Yeah. A raised wooden platform used formerly for the public execution of criminals. So that's also a really profound quote there, whether, one is Christian or not. So I know I said that was the last quote, and it is of King, but I want to address some objections to King that are not necessarily in this writing, but need to be talked about if you want a more comprehensive understanding of King and his philosophy. So Malcolm X sort of gives King this critique, and he essentially gives him the critique that King has a do-nothing philosophy, and he tells you that you should, love your enemies, and that you should basically not be violent with them. And he says it in more funny ways, calling him an Uncle Tom and Reverend Chicken Wing, and, stuff like that. But I do think that Malcolm X was wrong about King's discussion of self-defense, but he may be right in that King did not talk about it enough. King actually does address self-defense, and I'm going to give you a couple ways that he talks about it. So in his Social Organization of Nonviolence address, he writes about this, and he also does so elsewhere, but he doesn't talk about it a lot, like I mentioned. However, in speaking against retaliatory violence, King writes, quote, "Here one must be clear. There are 3 different views on the subject of violence." Here's the first one. One is the approach of pure nonviolence, which cannot readily or easily attract large masses, for it requires extraordinary discipline and courage. Interject this quote for a minute. What King is talking about here is an appeal to the Hindu Gandhi, and Gandhi's highest form of being in resistance, which is pure nonviolence. So he's referring to him as an example here. And then he says, the second is the violence exercised in self-defense, which all societies, from the most primitive to the most cultured and civilized, accept as moral and legal, period. The principle of self-defense, even involving weapons and bloodshed, has never been condemned, even by Gandhi, who sanctioned it for those unable to master pure nonviolence, unquote. And this is from King in The Social Organization of Nonviolence in a Testament of Hope on page 32. So I also want to read something else here that I think is also of value along these same lines. It's in An Experiment in Love. King says also along the same lines on page 17, admittedly, nonviolence in the truest sense is not a strategy that one uses simply because it is expedient at the moment, semicolon. Nonviolence is ultimately a way of life that men, humankind, right, live by because of the sheer morality of its claim. But even granting this, the willingness to use nonviolence as a technique is a step forward, for he who goes this far is more likely to adopt nonviolence later as a way of life. Here's the part I want you to pay attention to. But he just implied that you may not be using nonviolence as the highest form at first, and he doesn't necessarily condemn it. He sort of acts like that's part of the process. But here he says, it must be emphasized that nonviolent resistance is not a method for cowards. It does resist. If one uses this method because he is afraid, or merely because he lacks the instruments of violence, he is not truly nonviolent. This is why Gandhi often said, and King's sort of backing this, that if cowardice is the only alternative to violence, it is better to fight. He made this statement conscious of the fact that there is always another alternative. No individual or group need submit to any wrong, nor need they use violence to right that wrong. There is the way of nonviolent resistance. Of course, King is trying to say that's not the most ideal form, it's not the most transcendent form, it's not the pure form, and it's not the way that works out social crises the best. But he doesn't, he strongly encourages people to nonviolence in that way of life. But he is not saying that it can't be used. And he's also not saying that there aren't situations where it could be used. So, then I also want to point out this part. So I think there's a lot of confusion about King's inspiration. Is it from Jesus? Is it from the Christ? Or is it from Gandhi? Like, who is he inspired by? So I wanted to read this because I think this does give a pretty good response to that question. It says the read first and second half paragraph of An Experiment in Love. King says, from the beginning, a basic philosophy guided the movement. This guiding principle has since been referred to variously as nonviolent resistance, non-cooperation, and passive resistance. But in the first days of the protest, none of these expressions was mentioned. The phrase most often heard was Christian love. It was the Sermon on the Mount, rather than the doctrine of passive resistance, that initially inspired the Negroes of Montgomery to dignified social action. It was Jesus of Nazareth that stirred the Negroes to protest with the creative weapon of love. As the days unfolded, however, the inspiration of Mahatma Gandhi began to exert its influence. I had come to see early that the Christian doctrine of love, operating through the Gandhian method of nonviolence, was one of the most potent weapons available to the Negro in the struggle for freedom. About a week after the protest started, a white woman who understood and sympathized with Negroes' efforts wrote a letter to the editor of the Montgomery Advisor comparing the bus protests with the Gandhian movement in India. Miss Juliet Morgan, sensitive and frail, did not long survive the rejection and condemnation of the white community. But long after she died, in the summer of 1957, the name of Mahatma Gandhi was well known in Montgomery. People who had never heard of the little brown saint of India were now saying his name with an air of familiarity. Nonviolent resistance had emerged as the technique of the movement, while love stood as the regulating ideal. In other words, Christ furnished the spirit and the motivation, while Gandhi furnished the method. Unquote. Page 16 and 17 of An Experiment in Love from A Testament of Hope. So, that concludes King's philosophy, not in a all-out comprehensive manner, but probably the most thorough manner that you can get from reading one of his letters, with me adding some occasional other elements into the process. Thank you. Take care.